Pierre de Vos, who is the Claude Leon Foundation Professor of Constitutional Governance at UCT. Welcome to Judgment Date. Of course, I should also say that Pierre's well known for many other things, including being a regular columnist in the Daily Maverick. So, Pierre, let me ask you to start with, how do you sort of see our constitutional health, if I could put it this way, in the light of COVID-19? There's a huge amount of anxiety that as a result of the restrictions of COVID-19, not just in South Africa, all over the world, authoritarian tendencies are beginning to rear their head.
Yes, so this is a difficult question. It's maybe too early to say, in the sense that the Constitution is there. I'm sure that some of the actions taken, if they were to be challenged in the court, it might be successful. I mean, some of the regulations, I think, are so vague that they're not really lawful, and it's not really possible to know what kind of actions are prohibited or not. But maybe because of the temporary nature of the regulations and so on, there hasn't really been many cases taken to the court. While I'm sure that if the Constitutional Court is confronted with cases where the regulations are either infringing on the rights unconstitutionally and in a way that is not justifiable, or where the regulations are irrational, they will be declared invalid. The bigger problem is that because of the crisis, for obvious reasons, we are really bypassing the whole governance system. I mean, Parliament is completely missing in action. I think there were two portfolio committee meetings held, but they haven't really done anything. So the accountability which the Parliament has to exercise over the executive is not there. So we know that in any case in South Africa, the accountability of the accountability role of Parliament is weak. It's weakened for many reasons, including the fact that members of Parliament are beholden to their party leaders and not to the electorate directly. And so there is already accountability problem because the governing party members have party discipline and they are going to stick by their man. So far, it's always been a man. And so that is already a problem. So there's a problem of that there's now this command council or whatever they are called, and they, in a way, if they are deciding really what is happening in terms of these provisions, although the cabinet has a role, but it's a bit unclear where the lines of authority go. And so the danger in the long term, if this goes on for 6 months or a year, the system and the checks and balances are the fear is that they will not actually be effectively exercised and implemented. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it does in part, but let me ask you, does that then mean that you're suggesting at some point Parliament should be recalled in debating these issues?
Yes, because even we have chosen to go the route of using the Disaster Management Act, and I think for very good reasons, not the state of emergency, but the state of emergency is more extreme in many ways, but even there, the Constitution says that if there's a state of emergency, after the first 21 days, Parliament must decide whether it is going to be extended. So even the Constitution, the makers of the Constitution say that if there's a kind of emergency like this, where there are in effect now emergency powers, although the rights are not abrogated in the same way that it would have been during a state of emergency, then Parliament, there's a role envisaged for them. So I think it's very important that Parliament has some kind of oversight and accountability role. For example, the abuses, or if you will, the alleged abuses by police officers, and especially the South African National Defence Force, the case of Mr. Khoza, who was allegedly killed by soldiers. Those are the things that Parliament needs to hold the Minister of Defence and the Minister of Police accountable for, and the senior leadership of the military and the police. And it is a little bit surprising that they haven't really actively done so far.
why don't you, why, by the way, why do you say that a state of emergency shouldn't have been declared? Why, if that would have been the case, we would have had Parliament looking at this damn thing in 21 days.
Yes, but I think the difficulty with the state of emergency is, as I read it, it's more extreme, because the provision of the state of emergency says that the rights can not only be limited in terms of the limitation clause, they can be taken away to the extent that it is necessary to deal with the emergency. So as I see it, it is a more extreme limitation, if you will, on the rights in the Constitution, because it goes beyond what is permissible in terms of the limitation clause. At the moment, rights are not suspended. One or two of the ministers have actually claimed that rights are suspended in the state of emergency. That is not true. The rights are there. You still have to make sure that any regulation complies with the rights, and if it limits one of the rights, it can only be justified in terms of the limitation clause. While there are some limits put in that provision allowing for a state of emergency, as I read them, they are not as vigorous as would be the case for if you apply the ordinary Bill of Rights and the limitation clause.
All right, but I mean, the fact of the matter is that I accept that, but the state of emergency would have also allowed the government, for example, to commandeer private resources for public purposes. And surely that might have been a good idea, that you could have had the public hospitals, the private hospitals and the public hospitals integrated in one massive campaign to stave off the virus.
Okay, so that is a good question. I haven't thought of that. I wonder whether there is not a way of doing some of this without a state of emergency. Would it not be possible, if you think about the regulations? I'll have to go and look again, but there's one of the regulations which, if you read them in a generous way, says that the state can do anything else. There's a list of things that they can do to address the emergency or the disaster, and then it says at the end, the last provision, you can do anything else that is necessary to deal with handling the emergency or the disaster. So, of course, doing it in terms of regulations is a little bit tricky, but I'm not sure that it is not permitted in terms of disaster.
All right, okay. Yes, but let me just probe you on the securocratic point that you're making. I mean, the fact that there have been these allegations, I mean, obviously one's locked down, so one can't be sure whether they're true. One can't, but there's credible sort of media reportage of police excesses. Now, that's really that undermines your constitutional fabric in the first place. And that's very serious.
Yes, you see, the problem is, of course, that we know that police abuses happen all the time. You would know, Dennis, that every year the police pay out how many billions of rand in civil damages claims to victims of police brutality, police abuse, wrongful arrest, and so forth. So it's already happening. What makes this situation a little bit more dangerous, I think, is the deployment of the military. Now, many people have supported this, especially when it happens. And, you know, people, every time there's a crisis, there's gangsters on the western, in the township of the Western Cape Town, people say we must call in the military. But I think that has made things worse, because the military is even worse than the police, because they're not even on the surface, they are not even trained to deal with policing in this way, and so that is a problem. But the bigger problem, I think, is not just about this particular moment. There's a bigger problem with law enforcement in South Africa, with the respect for the rule of law that preceded the crisis and will be there after the crisis, because there is not great respect for the rule of law in the sort of law and order part of the government, the military, the police.
You see, that's what I want. Sorry to interrupt you, but that's what I want to push you on. It seems to me that when there are two things, perhaps. Let me perhaps expand my question. So on the one hand, I take the point exactly that there are people who don't really like the rule of law, and the old word that we used to use, krachtdadigheid, the idea of real sort of, we'll show you by using the repressive arm of the state, as we used to put it, still seems to be alive and well. There's a second aspect. It is clear that we've now got a lot of, if I could call it delivery protests, people being desperate, hungry, not being able to get any money in order to buy food, or food, as the case may be. Now, if you take the two together, that's the sort of rampant set of conditions, it seems to me, that actually could give rise to, if not the overthrow of constitutional democracy, certainly significant erosion thereof.
Yeah, you see, I'm always a sort of a...
Are you more optimistic?
I'm far more optimistic than you, although I'm very critical, but I am very optimistic, maybe wrongly so. But I think the big danger is that there are two things. Firstly, the regulations in some quarters of the government, they think they can enforce them through what you call krachtdadigheid. I mean, I read yesterday or the day before that 10,000 people have been arrested in KwaZulu-Natal alone for breaking the rules. That is no way, it is impossible in any kind of society where there is some freedom to actually impose regulations that are unpopular and that makes people's lives more difficult in many ways, including really depriving them of their livelihoods and maybe of food. It's impossible to enforce it that way. So there needs to be buy-in. There is a problem there. So we will have to see what the president says when he's going to announce new initiatives to deal with the economic deprivation out there. But I think what I would think about, maybe that's why I'm optimistic. Despite everything you see on Twitter and the noises that the populists make, I think South Africans, there is something about South African population that is not necessarily going to stand for an authoritarian state. I know that maybe I'm wrong.
Okay,
because,
yes. Let me put the following scenario to you.
Yeah.
And okay, so fair enough. Listen, I want to be optimistic, to be honest.
I'm trying.
No, you're doing well. This is not a time to be gloomy. But let me just put the following to you, because it's clear that there's a huge burgeoning literature all over the world about this particular question that we're debating now. So it's not a question of the population necessarily saying we don't like constitutional democracy. I accept that there are people who are very critical. You know that, I know that. I'm talking about the situation that if there is a non-delivery, because you've got a state that isn't capable of delivering on its constitutional legal promises, then people get very hungry, and then you get protests, then you get essentially what you're talking about, arrests, because then you get more repression. And before you know it, the argument is, we've got to use the authority of the state to maintain what is usually called law and order. And there lies the problem.
Yes, I agree with that. And that is possible. It might happen. I think that given the composition of the executive, I think there are people in the executive who may be, once again, too optimistic, but I think there are people in the executive who will try and avoid that scenario. So, and there will be people who are at least trying to deal with the enormous economic consequences of the lockdown. It might not be as efficient. It clearly won't be as efficient because efficiency of the state has been further eroded over the last 10 years. But maybe if I'm optimistic, I would think that they will do just enough to avoid the other route, which the president and some of the people around him would not want to do in any case for various ideological and other reasons.
So I accept readily that the president is a constitutionalist. I accept it for all sorts of reasons, including the fact that a book I wrote, he wrote the foreword to, which is a clarion call for constitutional democracy. But I mean, he's just, as it were, the president. There are other forces and political forces that take place. Now, in other countries, if you look at it broadly, the suggestion is that one of two routes take place in kind of, if you wish, the route of governance. Either there's a move towards nationalism, and we've seen that with Donald Trump, and to some extent, and certainly Bolsonaro and Orban, and we've probably with Johnson, or there's the alternative that we have to look more globally. Now, obviously, if we look more in a nationalistic way, then there are dangers to the constitutional enterprise, if I could put it that way. Are you suggesting that actually we should be reasonably okay that we're going to get out of this with our constitutional edifice intact?
I am not making a firm prediction. I'm expressing a hope. And I think that maybe, I mean, it's South Africa's, and we don't want to do the exceptionalism thing that we are different from anywhere else. Clearly, there are both populist forces in South Africa, and the sort of the xenophobic, nationalistic kind of noises. Yes, so those things are there, but I wonder, South Africans are quite a conservative lot. So I don't know if that makes a difference. Does it make a difference that people are not, they're conservative, but not necessarily, maybe on racial issues, quite nationalistic, but not as to this, I mean, it's not like Donald Trump. Maybe I'm wrong. But that said, I have to concede with you that there are dangers. If the government completely stuff up the economic part of the response to the COVID-19, and if even worse, I mean, it's not completely unrealistic to suggest that some people in part of the government might even deliberately try and sabotage these efforts. If that is a complete catastrophe, all bets are off. Yes. I am just being slightly optimistic, given that Jacob Zuma is no longer the president, and there's a slight change in shift, not complete shift, that they might actually pull off just enough to pull us through, if that makes sense.
Well, you see, I think that's right. I think we are. I think if I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it does seem to me what you're actually suggesting is that we're at an inflection point.
Yes.
That the wind, if I could put it, is slightly in favor of an inflection point moving towards a strengthening of the constitutional enterprise rather than a weakening thereof. Am I putting wrong?
Yeah, of course you're putting words in my mouth, but I would say that it is maybe not an inflection point. There is a point of danger. It can go either way. I would be slightly, in that sense, less optimistic and say I'm not necessarily saying that it will go towards strengthening of the democracy. I'm more of the muddling through kind of person who thinks that we will muddle through, the democracy will be more or less the same. I don't think the democracy is going to be fundamentally strengthened unless there is a political change of political forces in the country, because unless there is more competition in the political system, I'm not sure the democracy will be strengthened, because the system is made for a system in which political parties actually compete with each other and there's real competition, and at the moment we don't have that.
So both of us are sort of, constitutional lawyers. Both of us have written extensively on the field one way or another, and not entirely dissimilarly, I might add. So it's not that we have a difference of opinion on that basis. I'll come to one thing in a moment, which I just want to press you on. But here's the thing, as a constitutionalist, I just wonder whether we've got to the point where to have serious constitutional democracy lasting in a country, particularly when you've got social economic rights and on the one hand, and a very unequal society, egregiously unequal, and unequal on basis of race, where race and inequality essentially are inextricably linked, so that black people are not just previously disadvantaged, they're presently disadvantaged. Sadly, I say that, desperately. The question is, can you really, in the long run, have constitutional democracy if the state can't deliver to those most in need?
I don't think you can have really a healthy and functioning democracy. You can have some form of governance that is not authoritarian, maybe, but this is probably more than the COVID-19 crisis. I think that the inequality that you point out is the biggest danger to the health of the constitutional democracy. It's for some reason 25 years, and maybe I'm going to contradict myself now, but for 25 years, we have muddled through despite this absolute catastrophic inequality, maybe because one party was dominant. So it's a catch-22. On the one hand, the system is sort of not working because one party is dominant. It's not working as it should, but we are muddling through exactly because the ANC has been a kind of binding force that more or less are keeping things together in a strange kind of way. So it's now I'm sounding very pessimistic, but it's damned if you do and damned if you don't. The fact that we are not damned completely though, because we have this democracy, we have the courts, we have the Bill of Rights. We live in a completely sick and abnormal society, but we're sort of holding it together, maybe because, in some strange way, because of the ANC.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I don't necessarily want to get into party politics. I accept readily. Let me point absolutely. I think it's an extraordinary achievement that 26 years later, almost 26 years later, we're coming up to that we are living in a constitutional democracy. You and I are old enough to remember sort of really racist and conservative inextricably racist and conservative white people who always used to say there'll be one man, one vote once. Yeah. Remember, in relation to if there was majority rule in this country. And it's fantastic that we've lived in a freer society in the last 26 years than in the whole history of this country. But I suppose the point is this: I'm worried that that COVID-19 merely will exacerbate the inequalities, which are already so awful, because we're going to struggle economically. And then that flips back to the notion of the Constitution. In a sense, it seems to me as constitutionalists, we have to look at these things together. Now, we're not economists, but we should still be looking at the things together.
Yes, so I agree with you completely. I mean, it's a nightmare, basically, because there's this absurd idea that people say we are all in this together, but it's of course not true. Yeah, I'm sitting in my apartment and there are people who are homeless. So we are not all in this together. And it's a huge problem. The question though, so there are two issues that one must distinguish maybe. The one thing is that the constitutional democracy cannot only really flourish and survive and then flourish if we reduce the inequality and the absolute deprivation of a large part of the population. But that is slightly different from whether the Constitution, with what you mentioned, the social economic rights, to what extent that can actually contribute to the change. I think we're agreeing on that we have to be careful not to think that the Constitution, as long as it's there, that is going to address the inequality. It isn't. It cannot. Efficient and capable state with some moral principles and heart is supposed to do that. And so the only way in which this is going to survive if there are people in government who are more or less competent and are more or less progressive and care about inequality.
Okay, so I'm running out of time and I want to ask you one final question. Recently, there was a totally different subject, but you write for the Daily Maverick and the
about the lawyers.
Yes, the editor will be very happy that I read it carefully, as do many others. And we were particularly amused, a number of us, amused as to why you were defending that judgment, the poor lawyers who came there. Why did you think they acted wrongly?
Well, I was a little bit careful. I didn't praise the judgment. What I said is, on the face of the judgment at least, there's a rule. You have to have a certificate. They came there in the writing of the judgment at least, gung-ho. They didn't have the certificates. I thought, well, if you're a lawyer, you are the first person who has to adhere to the rules that are set out. If you don't, well, so be it. It's not the end of the world. They are probably all rich in any case. So a few 100,000 or 1,000 rand is not going to be the end of the world for them. So I don't have that much empathy with the lawyers, you see.
But there's a principle here. They came to represent their clients. And by the way, it was quite important what they were coming to do. I mean, these guys were actually doing quite important public interest work.
Yes, so you have a point there. I'm not. This is not a point I'm going to make a last stand on. There's clearly the problem that the judge actually there was some solution of the case, and then he punished them.
Yes, that's the other point. Yes.
Yeah, but you see, two things can be true at the same time. You can say that the lawyer should have had the permit, and you can say that the judge or that they should. So I think the judge was in a way, he tried to make the best of the worst situation, because it is important that the case should have been heard, and the case was resolved, but the lawyers didn't follow the rules. So both things can be true.
Well, Pierre, I'm only asking you that because I fear that if I didn't ask you this, a whole lot of people would have been saying, why didn't you ask them about this? Not that the most important article that you've ever written, but it clearly did create quite a controversy. Pierre de Vos, thank you very much. I mean, it seems to me that what we've been talking about in this conversation is in many ways goes to the heart of the future enterprise. I'm pleased that you're optimistic. I think we need some optimism, but it is clear that we also need a great deal of caution and vigor if we're going to vigorous kind of examination of what happens, if we're going to preserve that space. So thank you very much for being on Judgment Date.
Okay, thank you.